Hello and welcome to week 15 of Plant Bio at NICC. We're getting close to the end of the semester. Uh, if you're watching this lecture before or after Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving. Um, and this week and next week we're going to be talking about angiosperms. So last week we talked about gymnosperms, so these primitive seed-bearing plants, and now we're moving sort of through the evolutionary tree and we're moving into talking about angiosperms. So we're going to read from chapter 26 in the Biology 2E textbook as well as chapter 32. So this is, again, sort of a continuation of these chapters, but now in this particular, for this week, we're going to be talking about the angiosperm section rather than the gymnosperm. So in 26.1, we'll review the general evolution of seed plants and pick up with the evolution of angiosperms. And this is really where we see the development of this type of plant after basically 200 million years of plant life on this planet being dominated by gymnosperms. This time frame where gymnosperms really dominated the plant life on this planet really represents a pretty significant amount of time during the evolution of life on this planet. And it's only after this period where we see the development of the diversity of plants that we see in our world today really taking shape. In most places around the world, angiosperms are the plants that dominate the landscape. Here in Iowa, we have sort of forests and prairies and things like that. And although there are pine trees in the landscape, really we're looking at trees like oak trees, maple trees, things like that, and those are angiosperms, and they really dominate the landscape. If you move to a prairie sort of landscape, that also is dominated by the angiosperms. So angiosperms have been really successful from an evolutionary standpoint, and they really dominate nearly all terrestrial landscapes from a plant biomass sort of perspective. With gymnosperms, we saw the addition of the development of the seed as an evolutionary advantage, right? It provided a way for reproductive material to move out into the landscape in what are otherwise pretty inhospitable places. Here with the angiosperms, we still see the seed development because there are definitely seeds in angiosperms, but we also start to see the development of flowers and fruit. These additional adaptations really make the angiosperm group much more competitive in an evolutionary sense than the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms maintain dominance usually in really arid or dry conditions or really cold, sort of near Arctic conditions. So we see the boreal forests of the north still dominated by gymnosperms, but as we move into more temperate climates, then we can see where angiosperms, those adaptations for the cold and the dry, those balances don't really add up, and you start to see these evolutionary advantages from the angiosperms picking up and moving the dominance from the gymnosperms to the angiosperms in these sorts of habitats. With the evolution of flowers in angiosperms, this gives a safe place for embryos to develop. Again, it provides sort of protective structures. It also gives rise to specific pollinators. So if you think about hummingbirds moving from flower to flower, drinking nectar out of the base of those flowers, they're after that sugary nectar as their food source, but they're also moving pollen on their heads. That's an important consideration when we're talking about evolution, that we can have this specific way that genetic material is moved from one generation to the next. That provides an advantage rather than just the broadcast pollination through the wind that we get with gymnosperms. With angiosperms, we start to see very specific pollination patterns and plant pollinator interactions that we just don't see with gymnosperms. Along with flower development, we also see fruit development. The development of fruits really provides a protective case around that developing seed, but it also in some cases can provide an incentive for dispersal. So if you think about, say, an avocado or something like that, that fleshy fruit around the seed provides a food treat for an animal to pick up that fruit, eat the fruit, deposit the seed. Whether that seed moves through the digestive tract or not depends really on the reproductive strategy of the plant. Some seeds move through digestive tracts just fine, some are destroyed and just rely on being dropped as part of the eating process. It really depends on what sort of plant you're talking about. But understand that the fruit development provides both the protection for the developing seed as well as a dispersal mechanism for that seed. Those are really two key points to take away from fruit development. That's basically covered in 26.1. We'll skip through 26.2, which again is talking about gymnosperms. Moving on to 26.3 in the chapter, we sort of talk about the more in depth about the natural history of the angiosperms, and we see that this group of plants evolved during the early Jurassic period, but really doesn't come to dominate the landscape until much later. And again, pointing out these evolutionary changes of fruit development and flower development as those keys for angiosperm success. Moving through that chapter, we'll talk about sort of flower structure. What makes a flower? How is that different than a pine cone? Their flowers, again, are modified leaves, as are pine cones, but we see that the structures are a little different, and as you're reading through that, take note of those differences and what the different structures for the flowers are. Figure 26.14 is a good example of information that would be important to know. We're also going to be talking more about the life cycle of these plants, and we're going to see that angiosperms, like the gymnosperms and the non-vascular plants before, also have this alternation of generations where we have the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation. With angiosperms, as with the gymnosperms, we see that the sporophyte is the dominant life form out there. So the grasses that we see, the trees that we see, the shrubs that we see, all of those angiosperms in the landscape are the sporophyte generation of those organisms. And so we see this continued dominance of the sporophyte generation over the gametophyte. And we really don't see the reverse of that, where the gametophyte is the dominant stage, except in these very, very primitive plants, these non-vascular plants that we talked about a couple weeks ago. We still see the male and female gametophytes as pollen and ovules, and again, figure 26.15 provides a good framework for that. One thing that we do see different with angiosperms is a type of fertilization of these seeds called double fertilization. With double fertilization, you have sort of a two, as the name would imply, a two-stage fertilization of these structures, where one fertilization is a combination of these gametes, which produces this developing embryo, and we also have this fertilization event which produces what's called endosperm, which provides the food supply for the developing embryo. Now, this is important because having a fairly significant food supply allows even more stable environment for a seed to exist in the environment while it waits for good conditions to germinate and grow into a new plant. We don't see that with the gymnosperms. So this double fertilization and development of the endosperm is an important difference for angiosperms. Moving through, you'll also read and start to understand the difference between what we call monocots and dicots. You guys are familiar with that, even if you don't know it. If you think about, say, a peanut, if you crack open the shell of a peanut, you have the little round peanut that's left. You can split that peanut in half. each of those halves is a cotyledon from that plant. If you've never noticed it, take notice next time you have a peanut. And there's also a little sort of triangular sort of shaped nubbin piece. That's the developing embryo. If you're eating them cooked, they've been roasted and they're no longer viable, but they are delicious. So with peanuts, we have these two halves of the cotyledons with this developing embryo. As this plant would have grown and developed, those cotyledons push up out of the ground and they provide a food source for that developing embryo. With monocots, so monocots are things you're probably most familiar with them as grasses in the landscape. Pineapples and bananas and lilies and things like that are also monocots, but grass is a good example of a typical monocot. Here we have only one cotyledon, and that usually provides a food source that actually stays underground, and the plants grow up from there and develop outward as roots as well. Also talk about the structures of what's called a perfect flower, where we have both stamens and carpels on that flower. Excuse me. And we also start to discuss fruit development. Now, fruit is a really broad term, and lots of different things fall under the category of fruit. But understand that fruit has a very specific meaning that is not the same as eat your fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables in sort of colloquial sense, there's a difference between my lunch apple and a green pepper, which I don't have. A normal conversation, you say one is a fruit and one is a vegetable. In a botanical sense, both of those are fruits. So fruits really refer to these reproductive structures. So things like acorns are fruits, apples are fruits, rice grains. So the grains that we eat as wheat, rice, corn, things like that, those are all fruits as well. And they really serve as different sorts of transport mechanisms for these plants to move their genes to a different place. So fruit is a specific term, botanically speaking, rather than just in a sort of everyday usage. So that kind of covers what I'd like you to cover this week in Chapter 26. That'll be some review from last week and sort of continuation of last week as well, but also really starting the conversation about angiosperms specifically. Additionally, reading in Chapter 32.1 and 2, this is going to go even deeper into the reproductive structures that you're going to see with angiosperms. And so go through the sexual reproduction stages of angiosperms specifically, looking again at the parts of the flower, looking at the male and the female gametophyte. And really important in this part is a deeper discussion about pollination. Pollination is critical to the continuation of human life as we know it on this planet. Many food crops are wind pollinated. So if you think about grasses, so wheat, rice, those are wind pollinated species. But the pollination by insects and other animals is critical to economic systems and food systems on this planet. We get pollination events as motivators. We can either have the pollen itself being the sort of motivating factor for the pollinator to eat as a high energy food source, so bees will eat pollen. That's what they're after. You can also have nectar at the base of flowers and the pollen just sort of gets picked up incidentally. Or we can also have pollination being motivated by the smell of decay. So some plants use sort of a putrid smell like rotting flesh as an attractant for flies and beetles and things to come and pick up pollen and move it to another plant. So pollination is a really important consideration when we're talking about angiosperms, and we really see a big diversity in pollinators and pollination strategies with angiosperms. All right, that should keep you guys busy for this week. Next week we're going to continue talking about angiosperms. And either way, whether you have or you have yet to have your Thanksgiving holiday, I hope it's great. Thank you.